In the first part of the semester, we introduce ourselves to various key economic indicators so that we can use them to assess the condition of the economy. The second part of the semester, we are going to allocate the time to introducing ourselves to tools, economic models that will help us analyze the macro economy. We will first start with business cycles. We'll introduce ourselves to business cycles, what that means, and most importantly, we are going to try to explain why we have the business cycles using one of the most important economic models that we are going to have this semester, aggregate demand, aggregate supply models. In the economy that we live in, we go through economic fluctuations. On average, 3 to 5 years. Economic fluctuations or business cycles means that, well, sometimes the economy is doing very well. The unemployment rate is low. Corporations find it very easy to make money, very easy to earn profit, so they don't hesitate to hire workers. So when the unemployment rate is low, consumer households find it, quite optimistic, and they will spend more, and so on and so forth. So that's the good time. So at some point, companies will find that they maybe have overextended themselves. So they will cut back on their cost, they cut back on their hiring. So this time, unemployment rate starts to climb up. And at the same time, consumer households may feel the pressure, so they do not want to spend as much, which in turn translates into businesses that are not so robust. So this is when we go from the peak to down, we're going down from the peak. So things get worse and worse and worse when we go down the hill until we hit the bottom. So this is when companies feel that, well, we may have laid off, every single workers we can possibly lay off. We are lean enough. So it looks like maybe it's time to, get back one or two more workers. So this is when hiring starts, unemployment rate starts to climb up. So consumer households feel a little bit upbeat, they start to spend, and then companies feel that, well, businesses are getting better, and that's when we climb uphill, and so on and so forth. So this cycle repeats on average every 3 to 5 years. Obviously, in the United States, the past cycle was an unusual one. We had a recession in 2008. People have been talking about another recession, but now it's 10 years past. We are still doing okay. So this is an unusually long cycle, but this is because of some unusual measures that were taken by policymakers all over the world during the crisis in 2008. So that is beyond the scope of our class. So before we go too far, I would like you to look at some data, some charts. So this is a very useful website. This is FRED website, FRED. This is a set of data set that is compiled by the Federal Reserve of St. Louis. This is not the primary data, meaning that, well, the Federal Reserve of St. Louis doesn't really go out there to collect and then calculate unemployment rate, GDP, inflation, and so on and so forth. Instead, they just draw all these data from different government agency, Bureau of Labor Statistics, for example, and then put them all together in one place. This is a very handy website because you can pretty much find all economic indicators of your interest in one place. So why don't we type in GDP? So let's look at the level of GDP. Okay. So you can see that, well, it's an upward trend all along, starting from 1947. So the United States has been growing, has been on an upward trend. The U.S. economy has been expanding as far as we can remember. Okay. But you can see that there are these gray areas here where we have some downward blip. Okay, so this is the downward movement in business cycles. Okay, so it is not so clear because we're looking at the long-term trend here. It's not so clear that you see the business cycles, and you don't see a lot of cycles here. You just see upward trend. So why don't we change to another chart? So this time, instead of looking at the level, let's look at the percentage change of GDP. Okay. Then you can see the fluctuations. Okay. So you can see the fluctuations. So sometimes we're up, sometimes we are down. Okay, so this downward spike here. So negative growth in GDP means the economy is shrinking. So when it is positive growth, that means the economy is expanding. So most of the time we are expanding, but there are times when we actually contract. So this gray area here, these gray areas here are what we call the recession. So these are marked recession in the history since 1947. Okay, so the most recent one obviously is this area here, 2008. Okay, so much for data. Let's turn to some terminology. Before we go too far introducing ourselves to aggregate demand, aggregate supply models, I would like us to familiarize ourselves with some of the terminologies so that we can speak the same language in economics. So first, recession. Recession obviously is not a very new term to most of you. Most of you probably have seen it in the newspapers and so on and so forth. Recession. Recession, technically speaking, is a decline in total output, which is measured by real GDP for 2 or more consecutive quarters. So in order to qualify as a recession, we would have to have a shrinking economy in terms of a decline in total output for at least 2 quarters in a row. So that is a recession. Growth recession, okay? Another term, growth recession is not heard of very frequently anymore. It was mentioned more frequently in the early 2000s during the Bush administration, Bush Jr. So during that time, we came up from a very brief recession. In 2001, it was very brief. It was exactly 2 quarters. We came out of it, but the economy was very sluggish. Sluggish in the sense that the economy was growing. So technically, it was not a recession because the GDP was growing. However, it was growing so slowly that it was not justifiable by the resources and technology that the United States has. So a lot of economists argue that it was actually it actually felt like a recession. So it was termed growth recession. So it's a period of slow real GDP growth. Depression. Depression is a period of prolonged and severe decline in real GDP. So it is a recession, but it's a more severe one. It's also a long one. So what was the period of depression that you remember or you have heard of in the United States? So I'm sure most of you probably would say the Great Depression. So when you take history of the United States, you probably have heard of that. So that's in 1930s, the Great Depression. So that was one of the significant episodes of depression that we've had. It was very severe. At one point, 25% of unemployment rate. That means every 1 out of 4 people couldn't get a job. And then also at the same time, it was very long because it lasted for more than 10 years. It went all the way from 1930s to 1940s. So that was a very long one. So that was a depression. And then there are other terms that are less formal, but we tend to use them in our conversation as economists quite a bit. So let's get familiar with it. Economic boom. Economic boom means good things. It means that the economy is doing well. It is growing quickly. Expansion is quite self-explanatory, so that means the economy grows. Usually we mean the GDP grows. So contraction, so the economy shrinks. Okay. Slow down. So sometimes the economy doesn't shrink, doesn't contract, it's still growing, but it grows at a slower pace. For example, last year it grew at 5%, and then this year it grows by 3%. It is still growing, so it's not contraction, but it has slowed down. And then sometimes we hear the term overheating. So this is when the economy grows too fast, too much, usually because of too much spending. So when we have too much spending, either it is because of consumer spending or driven by investment spending, buyers chase goods and services. When buyers chase goods and services, so what that means is, the supply, there's not enough goods and services in the market out there. So when buyers chase goods and services, they tend to bid up prices. So that is when we see high inflation. So that's what we mean by overheating. Stagflation, so that's two bad things at the same time. Stagnation plus high inflation. So stagnation. So that means the economy is either slowing down, or contracting. And at the same time, the economy has high inflation. So those are two bad things at the same time. So one of the significant episodes of stagflation we have had in the recent history is 1970s, when we had an oil shock. Oil shock means major oil-producing countries, mainly in the Middle East at that time, decided to raise the price of oil for the very first time to the developed world, including the United States. So all of a sudden, the oil price soared, and at that time, the United States and other developed countries were very much dependent on oil. We are still dependent on oil today, but we were much more heavily dependent on oil at that time. So that caught all these countries by surprise, And businesses obviously couldn't do well because the cost of everything has gone up because all these businesses depended on oil for their production, for the transportation, for energy, and so on and so forth. Okay? So that brings us to a stagflation in the 1970s. Very high inflation, very high unemployment because the economy contracted. So what brings about business cycles? We're going to talk about the details of that later on, but right now we're just going to give a very, very brief summary of the types of shocks that can bring about business cycles. When we talk about shocks in finance or economics, we do not necessarily mean something bad or something negative. No. By shocks, we simply means something unplanned, something unexpected. So generally speaking, there are three types of shocks: internal market forces, external shocks, and government policies. Internal market forces has something to do with market participants, buyers and sellers. So take, for example, if consumers, for whatever reason, feel very patriotic, do not want to buy foreign goods, that obviously has economic implications to the U.S. economy. Or firms, for whatever reason, feel that, well, they don't want to produce as much, or they can't produce as much. So that obviously has economic implications. External shocks are shocks that are beyond the control of market participants. Take, for example, a war, a natural disaster such as a hurricane. Hurricane Sandy, for example, if we still remember, definitely had devastating effects on the economy, at least the regional economy. Government policies, governments plays very important roles in the economy these days. So government policies can take a lot of forms. For example, governments can, impose investment tax so that, to discourage companies from investing. Or governments can, lower the income tax to encourage consumer to spend more, and so on and so forth. So all these have economic implications. So every day we have a lot of shocks in the economy. So what we are going to do as economists is we want to translate all these shocks into macroeconomic outcomes. What that means is, well, if something happens, if a war occurs, for example, how will that affect the U.S. economy? So that's the thing that we are trying to that's the question that we're trying to answer here, and we're going to do that with the help of aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, ADAS model. This is an extremely important model in macroeconomics. None of you can step out of a macroeconomic class without knowing what aggregate demand, aggregate supply is. Aggregate demand is the total quantity of output demanded at alternative price levels during a given period of time. Okay. So, for some of you have taken microeconomics, so here we want to take a few minutes to clarify the difference between demand, which is what you learn in SSE 103, a microeconomics class, and aggregate demand. In your microeconomics class, SSE 103, when you talk about demand, you tend to think about demand demand for computers, demand for smartphones, demand for food. So demand for individual goods and services or individual categories of goods and services. Here in macroeconomics is in SSE 104, we are not interested in the demand for a category of good or a category of service. We are interested in the demand for all goods and services produced within the border of an economy. Okay, so that's aggregate demand. And also in microeconomics, sometimes you look at the demand of an individual, my demand for computers, for example. You sometimes also look at the demand of a community. So the demand of our whole class for McDonald's Big Mac. Okay? So in macroeconomics, SSE 104, we are not interested in individuals' demand. We are interested in the demand of all economic entities, consumers, households, firms, governments, foreigners, for goods and services produced by this domestic economy. So that's the difference between micro and macro. So this is how a typical aggregate demand curve looks like. Okay? So we want to be very careful here. Do not flip the axes. Okay? On the y-axis, well, in economics courses, we do not like to use y-axis because y a lot of times means something different. So we like to use the vertical axis. So the vertical axis, so we have the price level on the vertical axis. And be very careful here, we are in a macroeconomics course, so when we talk about the price level, we are not talking about the price of single goods or single categories of goods. We're looking at the price level of all goods and services. Okay, so it can be measured by CPI, for example. It can also be measured by other price indexes such as GDP deflator. So this is a price level, which is very often denoted as cap P. And then on the horizontal axis, we have the real output, which is very often denoted by cap Y. So this is the aggregate demand curve, downward sloping aggregate demand curve, which is usually denoted as cap AD. What underlies aggregate demand? Basically, we're looking at four major components of expenditure or spending. Nothing new. You have seen this before. You have seen this when you learned GDP. So these are the four types of expenditure that make up aggregate demand: consumption, spending on consumers, goods and services; investment, company spending on capital goods and services; and then we have government spending; and then net exports. Okay? So to tell us the relationship between these four components with the aggregate demand, so let's look at an example. So suppose we have a price level. So we are now at P0 and we collect the data. We find out that consumption is $300 million, investment $100 million, government spending $200 million, and net exports $50 million. So we add them up together, we find that the real output demanded at P0 is 650. Okay, so 650. Okay. So If the price changes at a different price point, we find that at the price level P1, we collect the data again. We find that at P1, consumption is $250 million. Investment is $80 million. Government spending, $200 million. Net exports, $50 million. We add them up, and this will give us the real output demanded at P1. Okay, so this is how we relate each one of these components of expenditure to the aggregate demand curve.